Hi, and welcome to The Good Fight on Blogging Heads TV. My name is Aryeh Cohen-Wade. I'm the managing editor of Blogging Heads, and I'll be the heard but not seen moderator for a debate today uh, between Megan McArdle, who's a columnist for Bloomberg View and the author of The Upside of Down, and Ryan Avent, who is economics correspondent for The Economist and author of The Gated City. And we're going to be talking today about the most exciting intellectual book published in a long time, Capital in the 21st Century by Thomas Piketty. Uh, Megan, I'll put the first question to you. What do you think of Piketty's work, and do you think he accurately captures what's happening in the economy?
Well, captures, yes. I mean, I think that there's a bunch of different books in here in a way. There is, the empirical work is very strong, and everyone is basically behind it. The question gets to be with the analysis, with the predictions, and then with the what is to be done section that you find in every book, and that's where people start contesting it. But in terms of are his charts looking at the history of capital and his little literary references explaining it? There's some like little quibbles with the literary references, but in general, yes, they're correct, and very interesting, and the book is very important.
And Ryan, what's your response to the book?
Well, I think Megan is certainly right that in terms of the criticism or the discussion that the book has attracted, that there's far and away everyone sort of feels the rush to say that the empirical evidence is fantastic, and there are some issues with kind of the rest of it. I think that some of the sort of shortcomings in the rest of the book are overstated a little bit. I mean, I think there's certainly an open question as to whether his outlook going forward is right, but he sort of says as much, and he says, I'm making kind of an estimate about what growth is going to do, what population growth is going to do, but I don't think he's sort of committing himself in any way to the forecast, and he sort of acknowledges, nobody can say for sure. And I also think a lot of the criticism of kind of the framework that he sets up for understanding how wealth inequality has evolved in the past and will evolve in the future is being, particularly by his sort of economist interlocutors, it's being kind of pulled apart as if he was trying to set up this really detailed, specific model. And I don't think he's tried to do that. I think he's just trying to give us a kind of a broad mental, infrastructure on which to build our discussions about the evolution of inequality. And so in that sense, I think it's really important, and I think he's mostly succeeded. And this is the way that people seem to talk about the subject now.
Uh,
I guess I would say that I think Ryan is correct. He doesn't have a model, or he has a very very simple model that has a lot of problems because it has a lot of assumptions because it's a very very simple model. And then when you start to dig down into a lot of those assumptions, you say, okay, well, really, is savings just going to stay flat as the rate of return falls? Do we really think that the rate of return on capital is going to? I mean, there's a bunch of technical sort of jargon stuff about, is the elasticity of substitution greater or less than one? But fundamentally, I think that he has to make a lot of assumptions about what's in that little model he has, and that a lot of those assumptions are pretty hotly contested, and I think legitimately contested. So I would disagree with Ryan about that. I do see him as making pretty strong claims about what the world looks like, and claims that are pretty deeply contestable, looking at kind of empirical evidence as well as theoretical models.
Yeah, I mean, I think I understand the point that Megan is making. And they are. I guess we should go ahead and say they are bold claims, and that's certainly why there's kind of so much discussion around the book. I think that.
oh, Ryan, why do you elucidate some of the claims that he is making?
So I think he says a couple of sort of critical things. One of them is that probably the one that gets the most discussion is the one that's captured in the inequality R greater than G, which he basically talks about the rate of return to wealth and the growth rate of the economy, and has this interrelationship between them. And he based on this inequality, we can conclude that if in fact the rate of return on wealth R is greater than G over the long run, then you will get this process of concentration of wealth, because wealth in the economy is sort of more concentrated than income, and you have the return to wealth going faster than the return to income, which is roughly going to grow at the same rate as the economy. And so this is the big force for divergence, is what he calls it, and the thing that's pushing toward growth and wealth. And we also have this dynamic effect where if you think that the economy is going to grow more slowly in the future, then that kind of accelerates this concentration of wealth. But this is a lot of people think this is not likely to hold for a couple of reasons. One is that if you get this buildup of wealth in the economy, it's going to be harder to earn a good return on it. If you have thousands and thousands of industrial robots, or, just the more housing you build, the harder it is to earn a good rent from that house, things like that. And this is sort of what economists call diminishing marginal returns to capital. And this, I think, is one of the points that people make when they question his assumptions. And then people also question whether it's accurate to say that growth is likely to slow in the future. If people end up not saving high levels of their wealth, and it doesn't matter what the return on their wealth is, they're still not going to end up accumulating. So these are all sort of questions that have been raised. I think the thing that I point to is just, I think this is where the empirical evidence, looking back at what has happened in the past, becomes really important, because he shows, and I think he does a pretty reasonable job showing that over the past 200 years or so, and really going back, he actually has a chart that goes back 2 millennia. In fact, the rate of return to capital, the pure rate of return, as he calls it, tends to be higher than the rate of growth, which hasn't been hard for most of human history, because the rate of growth hasn't been very high. It's only in the past sort of 150 years or so that it's been relatively high. So I think in some ways the burden of proof is on the people who say this isn't what the world's going to look like in the future, because it has been kind of what it's looked like in the past.
Well, I'm not sure that I agree with you that that's what's being contested. So I would say my take on this would be that basically everyone agrees that R is greater than G. That's actually not that novel. I mean, simply because if you're saving, if you're putting money into capital, you're deferring compensation, right? You're deciding not to eat your dollar today and instead to leave it, and you need to be paid to do that. You need to be paid to do that, especially because it's risky, right? Crazy things could happen in the future. We have no idea. So if you look at returns in the market, indeed, like you see that treasury bonds don't have a very high return. It's negative right now. And then riskier capital like equity has a higher return. So if you are invested in a lot of, equity, you're going to get a higher return than the average growth rate of the economy. That's very different from saying that capital is then going to increase and concentrate itself, right? You can have a model where R greater than G results in capital accumulation. You can have a model where it doesn't. And a lot of that depends on other things, like what are rich people doing with their money? Do they decide that, look, as I'm buying more robots, the return on each additional robot is just not that great. It's not enough to pay me to defer my compensation anymore, my consumption anymore, so I'm just going to go ahead and buy a big yacht and take a trip to Bali. Those things are what people are arguing about. They're arguing about, can we assume that the savings rate is fixed, as Piketty does? Can we assume that the rate of return on capital falls slowly, as he does?
Well,
and I think that a lot of people are saying
that's exactly right. I mean, I think that you're right that people contest those points, but there are a couple of things I would say. First, I think that it's very tempting to sort of say that Piketty's capital is the capital that we put in our economics production function, but it's clearly not, right? That's not how he defines it. It's wealth, which includes land and basically anything that can be traded on the market, and it's not.
Well, right, but this is a bit slippery, right? Is that like a lot of the stuff, the evidence that he's looking at to say that you're going to get this high rate of return that doesn't fall very fast is evidence from like physical plant. And so a little bit of this is that, yes, he is defining capital very broadly as it's really wealth. I think we're agreed on that point. But then if I ask myself, if I just keep pumping money, if everyone just keeps pumping money into the stock market, right? Does the the return on the stock market not go down? If everyone's just pumping money into housing, does the return on housing not go down? I think we have the answer from 2006 to 2008, right? So that.
But he's not looking at,
you know,
individual
yes,
categories,
that's
right? He's his rate of return.
I know, but when you smooch them all together, right? You get the idea. My understanding, and of course, I am not a professional economist. I'm just a journalist, so I could be getting this wrong. But my understanding is that in fact this is an issue because he's looking at data that suggests that the rate of return
Megan,
falls slowly, but
the
that
sound
is
dropped
data
out. Could you say that again? I'm sorry.
Sorry. My understanding is that you know, he's looking at the data. First of all, a lot of people are arguing, I think pretty fairly, that he has selectively read the literature on how fast the rate of return falls as you keep ramping up the amount of capital in the economy. But that second of all, the stuff that he's looking at is not, you know, it's not such a broad measure of capital. It's capital that is gross. You know, Larry Summers argues he's looking at gross capital, which is for those who are not following along at home. This is, you know, everything depreciates, right? Your house, as I can attest, sitting in this house, like stuff just breaks and you have to pay to replace it, right? So gross capital is the value of my house. Net capital is the value of my house after I have actually had to get a new roof and so forth. Every year stuff breaks and you have to fix it, and that is the rate of depreciation. And eventually it just becomes worth nothing in the case of a lot of assets. Is that he's moving back and forth a little bit between these categories, and he has to because, you know, the literature, the data you might want on what happens to net capital isn't necessarily out there. But that, you know, the fundamental argument is that in moving across these capitals, that he's applying things that are quite narrow to a very, very broad measure of capital, and that produces odd results that don't to other people seem consistent with the literature.
I guess I haven't really ever thought that criticism had much bite, because he says, so early on, his rate of return is a very specific thing, right? You take the total stock of wealth in the economy and you ask, how fast does it grow each year? And that's, I mean, it's not even, you know, that necessarily includes, you know, things like depreciation, because you're just looking at the change in the stock of wealth from year to year. And I think that, first of all, that's a really resilient measure, because that's what we care about if we're thinking about wealth concentration or wealth as a share or relative to GDP. It's just, what's this giant pool of capital doing? And so I think that there's for economists especially, there's this huge attempt to read this as this kind of micro capital or something of that nature, but that's not what it is. And so to me, that's why I think the burden of proof is on others and hasn't really been kind of answered in an incredible way, because, you know, if this in fact is what wealth does from year to year, has done from year to year historically, then to say that, well, yeah, but when we look at the rate of return on industrial capital in these industries, that's just not, I mean, that's kind of that's not relevant to the discussion necessarily. And I mean, it is a very interesting question. What are people doing? What are the wealthy doing to sort of ensure this growth in wealth year over year? And why does the economy work like that? I think that's a fascinating question, an important one. But I also think we need to be clear what the differences are.
Well, let's remember, though, that what we're talking about is fundamentally what wealth does in France and the UK up until about 1914, right? And then after that, what wealth does turns out to be completely different. And that what he's arguing is that we're going back to that. But we're talking about two countries, fundamentally. I mean, this is where the best data sets are, is in two countries. And that when you look at the capital of that era, how much does that wealth look like the wealth now? So, for example, and this is work from Piketty and Saez, right, is that, like, most of the people who are really rich in 1929 are living on capital. They're just collecting rents off of the real estate they own, the bonds they own, the stocks they own, whatever. They're clipping coupons, as the old phrase went. And that is how they make money. And when you look at the people on the Forbes 400 list, that's not how they make money now, right? Most of them didn't start that wealthy. They didn't inherit it. They made it. And you can argue, right, a lot of this partly is that there's a problem of deciding what's capital income and what's not. Is Mark Zuckerberg's income capital income, or is it labor income. It's
But regardless, he
somewhat
didn't inherit it,
unclear,
right? He made that money himself.
Right, he didn't inherit it, but it's more than that. It's like okay, so if I started in 1800, what is the land and what is the value, the capital in Balzac and Austin, right? It's land. It's actually just big, giant plots of land or government bonds. And then I moved to 1914, and what is the capital I'm talking about? There's still a lot of land. There's still a lot of government bonds, but the value of the land has fallen in part because the railroad opened up. Sorry, I'm getting a phone call. I have to ignore it, but it's somewhat distracting. So, part of this is that the railroad in the United States opens up a bunch of farming land. The value of agricultural land in Europe goes down. And meanwhile, the Industrial Revolution. So, the capital has changed forms, but it's fundamentally still, I inherited this, I have these shares of stocks, I have these government bonds, I have these giant tracts of something somewhere. And there's still a lot of that in Britain in 1900. When I look at what it is now, right, how much does the economy look like that? So for one thing, we have inheritance taxes.
Right, no, I think,
big inheritance taxes.
I think
and
you're
yes,
absolutely right.
You don't have to pay those inheritance taxes, right? But then you have to pay someone to not have the inheritance taxes, right? Yes, you can structure around and not pay inheritance taxes, but then you end up giving the money to a charity and they give it back to you. You pay a lot of money to lawyers. That in fact, you buy municipal bonds at an absurdly low rate, and that gives you tax-free income. But it's not the same as 1900, right? There's a big tax wedge. There is in the United States, although not significantly in Britain or France, a lot of philanthropy. And that matters. That ends up being a big wedge, as Brad DeLong calls it, that removes a lot of money out of the hands of. So partly it's that, when I look at capital now, it really is a lot different. And second of all, the other thing is that showing that in Belle Epoque France, inheritance matters a lot does not take me to inheritance in the United States that capital is going to concentrate, because these are actually two very separate things, right? There's one thing that says the stock of capital grows and the income off of that capital grows. And then there's another piece that says, and it will be in the hands of fewer and fewer people. Those are two separate things, right? The stock of capital could grow. It could all be owned by pension funds and widely distributed, or it could all be owned by Mark Zuckerberg. And those two things tend to get mixed up in discussion of this book a lot, I find, is that it is taken as, once you have proven that the return on capital grows, well, then everything else flows. And I don't think it does. And I think, in fact, we do have pension funds in the United States that own a large amount of stock, and governments that own a large amount, and sovereign wealth funds outside of the United States that own a large amount of stock. And that in a lot of ways, just Belle Epoque France or Britain in 1914 just aren't necessarily, they might be a model for what the United States looks like in 2070. But I think you've got a lot of ways to get to 2070 where that isn't true, right? Even if we don't have any wars, even if his assumptions about demography and growth are correct, which is itself sort of a big question, there are a lot of ways in which we could look at the markets and just say, look, in 1900, normal people did not own stock. They didn't even own government bonds. They didn't own anything. In 2010 America, normal people own homes, normal people own stocks, normal people own a bunch of stuff that they didn't own before.
Well, there's a lot of good and interesting points that you make there, Megan. I guess I'll start with the thing that you mentioned last, which is the kind of the ownership of capital and the distribution of it. And I think that Piketty owns up to this in the book and says, we have this, that the world fundamentally...
We're grappling with our fake exactly. French accent.
That the world is... This is one of the most significant ways in which the world has changed since the 19th century, is that capital ownership is much broader now than it used to be. At the same time, it's still interesting that it's still not particularly broad. That at no point in any society, even the most egalitarian societies like Sweden, has the bottom 50% ever held an appreciable stock of wealth, certainly not anything approaching their share of the population. And then also when you look at how the wealth itself is divided up, when you sort of add up all these 401ks that people have, it's not as large a share as you might imagine. Certainly, the concentration of wealth is significantly higher than the concentration of income. And so I think, so I think that we shouldn't discount the importance of having kind of the group from the 50th percentile to the 90th percentile who now own homes and have 401ks. That makes a big difference. But it's also, I don't think that we should, we're still in a world where outsized returns to capital could matter significantly over the long run. Now, I think that the other interesting question that you really raised here was the fact that the sources of income are different, and it's a huge difference. And I think it's hard to know exactly how that is going to play out in the future. And I think that what Piketty has tried to do is give us a framework for thinking about it. I think the question is whether these labor incomes, if that's what they are, that people like Zuckerberg are earning, do they end up being dramatically different from other sources of kind of windfalls, other wealth windfalls? And that once they're there, do they not just end up, once these stockpiles of riches are there, do they not just end up behaving like any other sort of riches? And it is true that you have people like Bill Gates and Warren Buffett who are giving phenomenal amounts of wealth away to charity, and thank goodness for that, right? But I don't think that ends up having sort of a huge redistributional effect overall. I mean, you still have, I think he has a statistic where if you look at the top 10 wealthiest people in the country, most of them end up being heirs. Now that's mostly down to the Waltons because they make up 5 or 6 members of that 10. But
yeah, I think that's
you
really,
can imagine
that's
that
one
in
of those
the next
things where if the Waltons are half your
given
sample,
the enormous piles of wealth that are being accumulated, that continues. And I think this is where
I can imagine it, but I also know that Bill Gates and Warren Buffett have both committed to giving all their money away functionally.
Right, but they're two people, and there are. I mean, for every billionaire who's giving most of it away, I think probably there are a lot you don't hear about that aren't giving most of it away. And I certainly don't think we can count on that as an engine of redistribution. But I think that to sort of go back to a point you made earlier regarding savings rates. This is when you have these sorts of phenomenal fortunes. This is where the dynamic of savings comes in and is interesting, because it doesn't much matter. There's just no way you can not save enough to perpetuate the fortune when you're a billionaire. The money piles up too quickly. And I think that when the dynamic changed between 1914 and 1945, this is essentially what he said, that these shocks that took place, like the Depression and the wars, they took enough of a chunk out of the fortunes that people could no longer just accidentally accumulate and maintain their vast piles of wealth, and the dynamic flipped, and that sort of led to this great compression in wealth. And I think now we are in a world where that doesn't look like that. That it is once you're rich, it's relatively easy to stay rich. And so at that point, we either count on these people giving their fortunes away, or we have to start thinking about more redistributional.
Well, but if that's the case, right, then you have to ask why wealth wasn't more concentrated than it is, right? I mean, he thinks that it concentrated over the course of the 19th century, but pretty slowly relative to the rate of return on capital. And the answer, of course, is that people are having kids and they're splitting up these fortunes. And if you look at the Walton fortune, right, fundamentally, it's not like everyone is turning into a little mini Sam Walton. They're each dividing it, and with each generation, it gets smaller and smaller, which is what happened to a lot of families in New England, who I'm sure we've both run into, right? The people who have the high school teacher who's got like a 1/80th share of some former plutocratic family compound on an island in Maine, that you actually need their reproduction to be really low for this to just keep concentrating in the hands of people.
That's true, Megan, but that takes, when you're talking about billions of dollars, that takes a really long time. I mean, the Waltons, if we're just counting on children, breaking up the fortune, they will be producing 100 millionaires for centuries.
I don't think that's right, actually. I mean, geometric progressions.
Are you talking right now, Megan?
They take a while to get rolling.
You dropped out again.
Sorry. I was going to say, I'm not sure that I agree with that. Geometric progressions take a little while to get rolling, but once they do, they're really fast, right? And I would also point out that, like, I do want to go back to this question of the rate of return, because we keep slipping off of it, and it's really important. It's the core, right? Because it's not enough for R to be greater than G. It has to be a lot greater than G. Because otherwise the fact that you're splitting these things up between kids, that you're splitting up a household income, even if it's 2 people, 2 kids, you're splitting up a household income that looks like one person, and then it goes to rate from the tax records, that's functional, views that as one person, and it goes to 2, and then it goes to 4, and then it goes to 16. Like, it progresses pretty fast after the first few generations. So I do want to get back to this idea, and I think that the Mark Zuckerberg thing is really instructive, right? Because it's totally true that as Bill Gates, right, has sort of left the company, what he's now enjoying is pretty much 100% return on capital. It's earlier work that he did that piled up kind of a claim on the future, and now he's buying down that claim on the future, right? But part of the question is, and I think Bill Gates is instructive here as well, which is that what do the returns look like when it's pure capital income? And Bill Gates's returns fell, right? Is that, like, once these founders are no longer at the helm, their companies don't necessarily display these abnormal returns that you get early. And so what looks on paper like a return to capital, Mark Zuckerberg stock options, right, is in a large part of arguably a return to labor, and that when it actually transforms itself, but it shows up in the data as a return to capital, and it's going to be pushing up the average return on capital. When that guy transforms it into a normal company at normal times, it's going to be lower. And so that over time, the more that past capital comes to dominate rather than currently created capital, as we now see in Silicon Valley, that over time those returns fall. The returns on the old capital fall, arguably. Again, we can go back and forth on this.
Gates' fortune is still getting bigger.
I think that. But it's getting bigger much more slowly than it did between 1980 and 1990. Sure. Right. Like the rate of.
But the wealth of the bottom 50% that don't own anything, their hoard isn't getting bigger because they, 0 times anything is 0.
Sure, but the wealth of the wealth of the bottom 50%, they've never owned anything. They don't own anything anywhere, right? Like the bottom 50% of most countries have a net worth very close to 0. Now they have like things that you can actually argue, is it wealth to have a claim on the pension system of Sweden? But they don't actually to be entitled to, when you retire, to have a stream of income. It looks a little bit like capital. It's not counted that way. But the other thing is that, we go to declining inputs, right? Is that the bigger it gets, the less valuable each additional unit of capital is, the less you have to get paid to save, basically, right? Because I've already got so much capital. I may be willing to buy a new robot, but I'm not willing to buy a new robot if you're going to charge me 10% on my money. And that this is especially important when you're talking about things like housing, things like where the return drops pretty quickly. And there's this paper from the French guys who argue that actually accounts for a lot of Piketty's effect recently, is the big run up in housing prices over the last 30 years. And if you control for that,
but why would you control for that?
This is really different from other kinds of capital. Because you look at it and say, well, theoretically I'm earning rent by being in my house, right? But I can't earn twice as much rent by living in 2 houses. I can in some metaphysical sense, but I'm not actually generating more income that I can spend.
No,
but I can't spend being in my house. And I can only spend it to the extent that it's actually displacing rent I would pay. And since I don't actually have the income to rent 4 different houses, yes, you can argue about all of this, but plowing additional money into extra, I think the core point is plowing additional money into extra houses has a much lower, it's very unlikely to just keep accelerating the way, say, plowing extra money into robots would.
Well,
and when half of the capital stock is structures, you have to take that seriously, right?
I think that one of the interesting things to come out of the book is a sort of, land, as you mentioned before, was hugely important to models of the economy in the 19th century. And I think Piketty's book puts land back in the conversation where it should be. And I think that it's not a knock on the book that housing is so important to wealth now. I think it's very it's a critical insight, actually. I mean, we look at sort of the places in the economy
right, but
around the world.
It's one that I think the criticism is that he doesn't really address that these rising land prices in what seems to be a handful of metro areas, something you yourself are very familiar with, seem to be driving a lot of this result.
No, I think he does, and I think that that's not something that undermines the argument that he's making. I think it's hugely important. I mean, rents, as we know, are sort of excess returns that you get because of the sort of natural scarcity of the property. And, the outsized rents that owners of urban land in San Francisco or New York City or in London, earn, are certainly coming because A, there's just only so much London to begin with, and B, people like to introduce artificial scarcities by making it difficult to build. But I think this is the way that economies work. And I think that if you are a fantastically wealthy person who has been able to invest in real estate now, as for the centuries past, that has paid off remarkably well, because the thing about land is they're not making more of it. And I think that the return of land, therefore, is as an important factor in both production and wealth, is incredibly fascinating to me. And I just don't see that as weakening Piketty's argument.
Well, for one thing, it's not something you can increase, right? Like, we can increase the dollar amount that I put, and say that we are both made sad, and Washington D.C. doesn't allow very much more building in Washington D.C., right? It's certainly not nearly enough to compensate for popular demand, right? So I've now plunged money. I buy another house. Now I've got two houses, and I'm renting one house out, but I didn't actually change the capital stock, right? In the really deep sense of, like, I didn't make something that's making the economy more productive. And if I have it, someone else doesn't. It's zero sum. And
I know, but that was true of estates also. I mean, if you're a wealthy manor,
but if I got more land, I could produce more grain. I was actually making something. Right, I could enclose it. I could do things that would make it more productive. I could add more people to it. You can do that in cities as well, Megan. You could take your second house, and subject to the zoning rules, you could turn it into a more productive, And we are treating this as that was the point of saying this is the fixed stock, right? Subject to the zoning rules, and in most of the places in DC, increasingly, like, so to put this 15 years from now, when everyone who can has built out a basement apartment, that this is different from building a factory. And that looking at the evidence of what happened when people built factories in France in the 19th century is going to be pretty different from looking at people bidding up the price on land in New York City because New York City won't let anyone build buildings. Something that, like, both you and I abhor, but it's not going to produce the same economic effects, right? When it goes into your model, it comes out.
I mean, I think.
I would think
the story of rising property prices in New York and London certainly has a lot to do with supply restrictions. But tight supply doesn't get you soaring prices unless there's growing demand. And I think that the importance, the rising economic role of these smart cities, which is another of the things that I've written about, I think it's a perfect parallel for the economic importance of agricultural land in the 19th century. And so that's why I don't see a fundamental difference. I mean, I think that we really are back in that world in a lot of ways. And I don't, to the extent that ownership of this high value land, this highly productive land, is limited because of supply restrictions and concentrated in the hands of the rich. This is just, it's an exact parallel to the kind of the lord of the manor who was earning his rents from these agricultural properties.
No, I understand that, but as I bid it up, right, what happens? Do we just keep bidding it up? Is that the like we're not producing anything extra because of the land. And in fact, arguably, a lot of this bidding is now taking land out of production, right? We take a single family, we collapse it into a 3-family flat building and collapse it back into one the way it was in 1850. I'm not sure I understand where the capital accumulation comes from, right? This is basically, yes, I can see the concentration, but I'm not see how this, it seems to me that in this model where all we were doing is bidding up the price of a limited thing that isn't itself changing or increasing or growing, that what we're ultimately getting is pretty rapidly falling returns to capital, right? Is that it should decline, I would think. I mean, maybe I'm being stupid. It's entirely possible. It wouldn't be the first time. But that, in the same way that, right, like, once people think a neighborhood's going to gentrify, almost all of the ability to make money by waiting for your neighborhood to gentrify is already gone because people bid it up to the expected value of the future house. And that is what I'm not, right, the stuff that's happening in the 19th century is actually being able to make
for part of the 19th century. But I mean, Piketty is not ignoring
most of the 19th century.
I mean, in the 18th century, land was king, and that it fits into his story. I don't think it's not something that is a problem for his story. And I think that, well, I think one point to make is just, look, are the returns to urban land falling? If you invested masses of money in New York City real estate or London real estate, how are you doing? And the answer is pretty darn well.
You're doing very well right now.
Maybe that's entirely speculative.
The question is, though, I think that's not quite my argument. My argument is, do I then think, okay, so I look at my parents, they bought an apartment for, I think, $23,000 on the Upper West Side in 1973. When they sold it, it was worth many times that. Is that a stunt that I think you could pull again today with the same apartment? In other words, could I buy that apartment and expect a tenfold? I mean, people have had in like, so areas of Tribeca or Soho, 100-fold increases in the value of their home. Do I think that I could then go buy that and expect that over the next century I'm going to get another 100-fold increase on that same apartment? I would be very, very skeptical that that's going to happen.
I think we should maybe move the conversation on a little bit towards Piketty's proposed solution for inequality, which is the global wealth tax. And I think most commentators say there's no way this could ever happen. Do you guys agree with that? And do you think if it could somehow be implemented, would it work even then?
Well, will it ever happen? No. I think that part is the easiest bit, and I maybe Megan disagrees. I suspect she doesn't. But
no, it's not going to happen.
What's that?
I think it's I don't want to say it's totally impossible, right? I can imagine some scenario in which aliens invade the United States, take over the world, and start levying global wealth taxes. But short of that, it is really, or I don't know, some global empire takes over. But short of that, it's basically impossible for me to imagine the degree of coordination that would be required to get a global wealth tax going. And it really would have to be global. I think what you've seen with, there's basically two problems with the wealth tax, right? The first is that it arguably impedes capital formation, which for Piketty is a feature rather than a bug. But most of us like to have more capital making us more productive, and so it's a bug for a lot of economists. It's arguable the extent to which this is true, and I think we can leave that aside, because the bigger problem is just that if you enact one, all of your rich people move, which is, France does have one, but like lots and lots of countries tried them, had them for a long time, and just got rid of them because what they had was a lot of nationals who decided they'd rather be domiciled somewhere that didn't have a wealth tax. And we do have them in the case of real property, right? Almost everyone who's watching this, or many of the people who are watching this broadcast, undoubtedly pay a wealth tax every single year on their home. But in general, broad wealth taxes are really, really
sorry,
difficult.
Megan, are you still?
I'm sorry, the sound
dropped out. Or was that my cue?
Sorry, I basically ran through. There's the incentive problem. There's the fact that people move. And then I think the third thing is that it's actually really hard to administratively to do a real global wealth tax or any sort of wealth tax, because what do you do if someone has a giant house that they live in and that's their major asset? Do you make them sell it? Like, do you, not all assets are liquid, and lots of assets are really hard to value. And so there are also administrative difficulties, but I think the main thing is just that you can't do it.
Yeah, I think it's a political non-starter. I think Piketty basically knows that. He sort of says, I'm going to put this out there as kind of a benchmark against which to judge other potential policies. And I don't know that the challenge is going to be that great to do something that's sort of similar. Megan mentioned property taxes. Inheritance taxes are another obvious thing to look at, estate taxes. But to me, this is, every book feels like they need to have their what is to be done section, and his is no exception. And given the ambition of the rest of the book, it's kind of a buzzkill. But I think that the argument he's really trying to advance is that if you don't do something like this, if you don't have a kind of a modest wealth tax that you manage to apply in a critical mass of economies, then there's a risk that the problem will continue, and that you sort of find yourself in a very unpleasant place politically, where people are starting to demand things that would be ultimately much more destructive to economic growth and to investment and things of that nature. And I think that's not a crazy thing to say. We might overstate the extent to which money has an influence in politics, but that may not be the case forever. And if you don't have to imagine some of the trends that we've seen over the past 20 or 30 years extending for very much longer before you start to get serious blowback to important market institutions, whether that's trade or, the workings of the financial system.
Yeah, I would say that I think that a more plausible, politically plausible method for reducing inequality would be to shut down immigration in rich countries, shut down trade, outlaw automation. Like basically what New Jersey has done with its gas stations, where it's illegal it's illegal to have a machine fill you up. It has to be done by a person. I think that the interesting thing is that he proposes something that's kind of crazy for a lot of reasons from a political economy standpoint, and not something that it's actually, to me, politically feasible to imagine shutting down trade and immigration and so forth. Not saying these are my policy preferences, but I actually think that this goes to kind of the whole policy preference section, which is like, we should do things that I like and don't care about because I like them and don't care about them. But if there's anything I actually care about, we shouldn't do it, and inequality isn't that big a problem. And that's like fundamentally how everyone treats the issue, right? Is yes, of course I'm in favor of reducing income inequality, but of course I would not be in favor of having women not work. I would not be in favor of doing away with free trade. I would not be in favor of doing away with automation. I would not, right? So ultimately, we don't care about it that much. We don't think that this is the defining issue of our time, because if we did, we would be doing all these drastic, crazy things that I'm opposed to. And I will say that more generally, I am very skeptical of his somewhat cavalier treatment of CEO pay and why, and the effects of what he's proposing. Which is to say that, he basically seems to think that if you enact these taxes, nothing happens. There's no incentive effect. There's other than that people maybe they stop having this hyperformation of capital, but there's otherwise no bad incentives. There's no need to worry about what happens to this manager class, because really they don't earn it anyway. They're just getting friendly boards to give it to them, which I think is contradicted by a fair bit of evidence. And that, we can argue about how useful CEOs actually are, but I don't think that I used to believe the friendly board story, and I no longer do. And so that I find kind of the weakest section of the book, is that when there appears an obstacle to the things that he would like to do, he sort of waves it away.
I think the points you make about trade and immigration are absolutely spot on. And one of the more interesting lines in the book to me is when he argues that a progressive income tax. The introduction of the progressive income tax has been critical to market liberalization over the past 50 years, to international trade and globalization. That without it, that just simply wouldn't have been possible. I hadn't really considered that in the past, and thought that was interesting.
That seems frankly crazy to me, given that trade was so liberal in 1914 when we didn't even have an income tax, or whatever.
We also had a much more limited franchise then, though, didn't we?
Not in the United. I mean, yes, mildly in the United States, but I don't think that women are the main reason that free trade.
No, but I mean, at the time that the introduction, or the repeal of the Corn Laws, I mean, this was a society dominated by rich merchants in London who had a keen interest in pushing a lot of this liberalization. But
But I mean, how do you? I don't understand. Like the high mark of free trade part of this era, right, is 1910 to 1914, right? At which point the franchise, at least in the United States, have been extended to, with the horrible exception of black males in the South, have been extended to every.
The U.S. economy was not particularly open.
United States.
I mean, the UK was an exception. Now, the extent of globalization, you're right, was was extremely high then. We didn't get back to that level of integration until about 20 years ago.
Right. And at that point, both the French and British franchise were fairly open, were they not?
No, you're right. But
males,
I think
that
if you look at it, if you look at sort of the world as a whole, it was still a very restrictive place.
Sure, but we're not.
I thought it was interesting. It's not a key.
Sorry. Anyway,
one
not
point
a key point,
though, which I think the reason the book resonated so much with me is because I've been doing a lot of work on sort of technology and its impacts on the labor market, and so the idea that ownership of capital was going to be critical in the future, I think makes an awful lot of sense. And we've had this research recently looking at trends in the income share going to capital and labor, and across most of the world, the capital income share has been rising, in some cases pretty dramatically. And I think that it doesn't take a lot of it. Now, Larry Summers' response to this, that technology is going to change everything, is that, well, if technology is changing anything, then you're not going back to the 19th century. It's just a different world. But which is true, but I think beside the point, which is that we're getting back to a world where access to capital and ownership of capital become critically important for distributional reasons. And so, that to me suggests very different policy approaches than the global wealth tax. It suggests that what you ought to be doing is looking at ways to broaden access to capital, ownership of capital, or to somehow make sure that you're in a world where most of the benefits, most of the income gains are going to capital, that translates into benefits for the broad mass of society. And I think, to me, that was the glaring gap in the policy prescriptions, is that there wasn't much discussion of that.
Yeah, so, I mean, this is interesting, right? Because someone pointed out that this is actually a very good argument for privatizing Social Security, and he was like, right, but no, we shouldn't do that, because it's risky. And I think that our own preferences kind of about the world tend to inflect this. And I think it's interesting because I've also been thinking a lot about this, about the robots are coming, robot overlords. I assume that's what we're talking about, right? And I guess I go back and forth on this, is that maybe it's really important to save, and maybe our coming robot overlords make capital almost worthless. Right, I can tell both stories.
Well,
is that at the point at which it becomes really easy to produce more capital?
The key dynamic there is, oh, sorry, sound dropped out. I thought you'd stop. Go ahead.
Sorry, no, it's that you can arguably see this, at least if you buy Ben Bernanke's global savings glut thesis, which is that there's too much capital chasing stuff, and you get temporary bubbles which appear to increase the return on capital, but then they keep collapsing again. And that maybe, the ability to use the amount of savings that there's demand for so that people can retire is just not all there. And maybe we're going to end up with a lot of savings chasing lower and lower returns. This is something I worry a lot about because I write a lot about personal finance. And sort of more broadly, I think I ultimately come down with Larry Summers, which is that if we're really right, because Brad DeLong says this when you ask him about the return on capital thing, and he says robots. That's what we're talking about. And at some level, I then get to a point where I say, well, if the robots are really that powerful, then I'm way more worried about them just deciding that I'm surplus to requirements than I am about whether my retirement fund is generating or whether my income inequality is high. I'm I think literally then get worried that the robots just decide they don't need this.
Yes. Well, that is certainly a concern.
Ryan, do you fear the robots, or do you welcome the robots?
There are lots of frightening scenarios, but I think that the problem is in between, right? Before we get to the kind of robot apocalypse,
before they liquidate us.
Yeah,
how are we going to live?
On the road to that point, at which point none of this will matter, you have a situation where the only way labor sort of hangs on to its role is by accepting ever lower wages, and where the people who are employing these robots, who will eventually turn on them, are making lots of money in the meantime. So I think it's that transition that's going to be tricky, and I think that's part of what we've been seeing over the past 10 years. But what I think, depending on what your views are on technological progress, could accelerate over the next couple of decades. And so that, for me, that's the way we see capital returning. And I think there's a parallel to the early 19th century. Now, by the end of the 19th century, workers were actually doing pretty well. Wages were growing pretty quickly. But for the first kind of actually 100 years of the Industrial Revolution, real wages were stagnant. And, some of this was due to the fact that prices for lots of foodstuffs were going up. Some of it was due to the fact that there was some de-skilling in manufacturing, that these craft workers had, suddenly found themselves only able to get jobs kind of working on looms. But, it's not necessarily the case that technological improvements automatically translate into gains for labor. And so I think, that's what, it's just, for me, I see a lot of things that resonate because, in a lot of ways, there are parallels between the 19th century and the 21st century. But a lot of it depends on just what your views are about what the path of technological progress is going to be.
Right.
If I could just break in and ask maybe one more question before we wrap up. Megan, you wrote a piece recently about income inequality, saying, Piketty's solution did work. Writing checks to the middle and lower classes is not the solution to their pressing ills. I wonder if we could discuss that idea briefly.
So I would like to point out that I was not, in fact, arguing with Piketty's book, which I had not read at that point. That I was actually really just sort of talking about the people who had seized on the book and the way that they were talking about this global wealth tax. Because, in fact, Piketty's idea about the global wealth tax, as far as I'm able to discern, is that it's not really about transfers. He doesn't think it's going to raise that much money. It's actually mostly just about discouraging people from accumulating lots of capital. Ryan, correct me if I'm wrong there. But that he's more interested in just saying, like, we're not going to let these big accumulations of capital accrue than he is about raising money to give to other people. And so that said, when I look at when I talk to people who are out living the stuff that gets rolled into inequality, stuff about factories closing down and so forth, I don't hear a lot of worry. And it's not like I talk to them every day or something, but, like most journalists go out and do stories and so forth. I don't hear them talking about how much stuff Mark Zuckerberg has. I hear them talking about not being able to hold a job that gives them good hours, that enables them to assume that the job's going to be there in 10 years, that enables them to plan their lives and have a decent life and form a family and do all the stuff that basically everyone wants to do, with some somewhat odd exceptions, right? And part of this, and something I wanted to ask Ryan about, is do we actually see trade as being about increasing returns to capital, or do we see it as about increasing returns to consumers? Because a lot of people who had capital have had that capital destroyed by trade. Because those things, the things like immigration and trade that are destabilizing to these people are somewhat, right, they're somewhat enhancing the returns to capital, but they're also doing a bunch of other stuff that is about making people rich in Africa and China and Vietnam, and those things are really good, but it's not a straight up transfer to people who own capital. It's a much more complicated transfer. And this is one reason that both progressives and libertarians don't want to shut it down.
Yeah, well, I think I think it's inarguable that when you are talking to most people, the thing that they care about and what they've had a lot of cause to complain about is their welfare. The most important fact for most working Americans is that incomes adjusted for inflation just haven't been going up. And that's a huge problem. It's a problem if you have taken out a mortgage thinking that your income is going to rise. It's a problem if you had aspirations for buying a house or sending your kids to college. That's what they fundamentally care about. But I think that, at some point there's a recognition, and I think there's a recognition among working people, and increasingly there's a recognition among economists that in fact there is a zero-sum element to what's going on between capital and labor. That if you are employing more machines to do work that labor previously did, there's a direct trade-off, and in the past that trade-off has ended up making everyone better off because we were able to reallocate people into other jobs. But if that is if progress is taking place at a quick enough pace where we're not able to do that, then there's clearly a zero-sum aspect of this. And so maybe they're not looking at Zuckerberg and saying, I want to take his house away because I don't like seeing rich people being rich. But I think there is a sense that the economy works for some people and doesn't work for others, and to the extent that people draw the connection there, that's a concern about inequality. Now, we absolutely shouldn't take our eye off the fact that global inequality has fallen dramatically, and there's been hundreds of millions of people lifted out of poverty over the past couple of decades, and a lot of that has not involved gains to capital, as Megan mentions. It's been gains to labor in emerging markets relative to those in the rich world. But I think that we are actually seeing an into this process, an into which globalization is connected necessarily to rising wages across the broad mass of workers in emerging markets. I mean, if you look at trends in income going to capital or trends in income going to the top 1%, they don't look that different for China than they do look for America or Britain. They don't look that different for India. The one place where they look really different is Latin America, which was, of course, the most unequal place in the world until about 10 or 20 years ago. So that's some good news. But I think that what we will increasingly see is as these poorer countries catch up to the technologies that are in the rich world, they will start to look more like the rich world in terms of their wealth and income distributions, and in the ways that capital is benefiting. And that I think would be an intriguing development. You might actually see a backlash to liberal policies in places where you wouldn't necessarily expect it.
So I guess I would say a couple of things about that, which I think is mostly right, is that right, there's basically two factors that I think most of us think are the main drivers of inequality in the world right now, and one is globalization, the other is automation. Both of which are just ways of being cheaper than workers who were doing jobs before that paid pretty well. And the reason that this matters, to draw this a little bit back to Piketty, is that if in a normal model you would often see you increase capital and then wages actually rise, right? Is because there's more capital, that labor is more productive, and the labor is relatively scarce compared to the capital. But of course it can go either way. There's lots of different factors, and that's what we saw in 1830. By 1850, 1860, wages are finally rising. But I mean, Dickens, right, reflects the zeitgeist of something that had happened 20 years ago, of this sense that there's just the progressive immiseration of the poor in Britain and elsewhere. And so, do the wages, when we finish globalizing, do the wages, what does inequality look like? If you compare people in America, working class people in America were rich, hugely rich, fantastically, unimaginably rich by global standards. And that those people got pulled down as the other workers, the other kind of less skilled workers in the rest of the world got pulled up because they were competing with those people. And that process, I agree, is probably, I think China's special. It's so big and it went so fast, right? And it's not done, but that it really was in a lot of ways special and probably not going to happen again. And at that point, that competition is going to ease off on American wages. As Chinese workers get richer, then that's going to be less of an issue. That leaves us with the robots. And the core problem that I see, and why I wrote that piece about the checks, it's not that, like, you can't say this person would like a check for this person would like a check for that. Right? We all like checks. Everyone likes getting checks. Everyone likes having people buy stuff for us. They would be happy if the government bought them more stuff. But that there's the really core thing that I actually think is what most matters is work. Is that work turns out to be so important. And even when you look at like Scandinavian countries, Germany or whatever, very good replacement rates on unemployment benefits, people who are out of work are miserable. So the check isn't cutting it, right? It may be maybe a good thing to do, right? We can argue the policy of it. I support unemployment benefits, although like somewhat time limited, but the check isn't nearly enough. It scratches the surface, but this person's still basically as miserable as they were when they were laid off. And the core question that I think we have to address is not who's getting the checks, right? It's what happens to these workers. I think I do think that is a more important question than who's getting the checks. Is that, do people have
Ryan, would you agree with that?
Jobs?
Yeah, well, yes. I mean, I think work is fundamental, and I think that's one reason why the automation story is so scary. And my view, I think, is that as you see employers finding it harder to get relief on wages by going to poorer countries because those wages, their wages in poor countries are rising, that's just going to make the incentive to automate all that much higher. And so my personal view is that we probably are going to need kind of a revolution in wage subsidies so that people who want to work can continue to work for next to nothing and still enjoy a high quality of life. Because it's just, as it stands, the way that we are trying to maintain full employment is by sort of minimizing upward wage pressure and shunting people into kind of relatively low productivity tasks, whether that's in the service sector or by getting them to do work sharing as they've done in Germany or things of that nature. And this is just not, it's not sustainable. It doesn't lead to kind of happy workers. It doesn't lead to higher wages. And so I think we probably will end up having to fundamentally rethink the system through some sort of income subsidies that allow everyone to kind of have their own Etsy store or, work for next to nothing on a job they like, something of that nature. But no, I mean, because people derive a sense of worth as well as an income from the job they do. And so it's going to be frightening to contemplate a world where there just aren't jobs for people. If in fact we will be in that way. Maybe everyone will just join the kind of robot fighting army that we have to establish to protect ourselves.
Well, I mean, then there will be full employment.
Right, exactly.
So the good news is that when they decide to liquidate us, all of this ceases to be a problem.
It really is the solution to everything.
Battlestar Galactica is America's future, basically.
Yeah, I don't know. Is there anything, Megan, that you wanted to say that we didn't get to?
No, I mean, I would say that I think that it's an important book, that the empirics are amazing, that it started an important conversation. But I also think that a lot of stuff that isn't really about wealth inequality gets rolled into that conversation and may in fact be the stuff that we're more anxious about, but less able to, I don't know, express or visualize.
I mean, I think that the sort of comparison with Marx, which he totally invites by calling his book Capital, is.
And then he's mean about him.
Everyone sort of assumes that he's a communist because he's called his book Capital, and he's not actually. But I think that's, what we will, it's sort of like Marx. It's going to be a long time. It will be a long time before we can fully kind of judge whether he got things right or wrong. And I think ultimately we will see that in some ways he was incredibly insightful and prescient, and possibly in other ways he messed up. And so, but I think that it is that sort of book where it's the kind of thing that will sit there and shape discussions for a long time, but really can only be judged fairly well down the road. It's a bold statement I've made. I think be able to know anything else. Really.
Yeah.
Going out on a limb.
I think I want to second that. Yeah. Predictions are hard, especially about the future.